Trump and his Christian nationalist freaks are abusing America. Former President Donald Trump continues to dominate headlines and political discourse. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel. I hope everyone is having a nice day before we begin the video. Please subscribe and give the video a thumbs up. But in recent months, the focus has increasingly shifted from his policy positions to the movement of Christian nationalist supporters that rally behind him, a faction whose influence has grown in parallel with Trump's political ambitions. Critics argue that this alignment of fervent ideology and populist leadership is eroding key democratic norms, reshaping the political landscape, and creating a climate in which religious zealotry is being weaponized for partisan gain. The intensity of Trump's base, combined with the ideological rigor of Christian nationalist elements, is fueling a culture of exclusion, fear, and political aggression that many analysts warn is unprecedented in modern American politics. Trump's rhetoric has long appealed to religious conservatives, but his recent strategy demonstrates a more explicit alignment with Christian nationalist priorities, including the promotion of socially conservative policies, the framing of political battles as moral crusades, and the positioning of himself as a protector of a particular vision of American identity. Critics describe this as not merely political mobilization but a form of ideological coercion, where dissenting voices are marginalized and policy decisions are framed as matters of divine mandate rather than democratic compromise. This trend is visible across social media, political rallies, and public pronouncements, illustrating how ideology and populist leadership can reinforce one another to create a highly mobilized and at times combative political movement. The influence of Christian nationalist supporters extends beyond rhetoric into tangible political actions. These groups have actively pushed for legislation reflecting their moral priorities, influenced party platforms, and shaped voter mobilization strategies. Their presence in the political ecosystem amplifies the stakes of elections, turning contests into battles over cultural and religious identity rather than purely policy debates. This alignment of fervent ideology with Trump's leadership creates an environment in which political disagreement is increasingly framed as existential, moral, or spiritual, heightening tensions and reducing space for moderation or compromise. Critics argue that this fusion of Trumpism and Christian nationalism undermines foundational democratic principles. By elevating religious identity as a criterion for political legitimacy, these movements risk eroding the secular framework of American governance, creating policy decisions that prioritize a specific religious worldview over pluralism and inclusivity. The consequences of this trend are evident in debates over education, voting rights, reproductive health, and the judiciary, where the moralistic framing of political issues can limit the scope of debate, marginalize dissenting voices, and polarize communities along ideological and religious lines. Social media has been a critical vector for the amplification of Christian nationalist messages aligned with Trump. Platforms allow for rapid dissemination of religiously infused political content, unfiltered commentary, and calls to action that energize supporters and intimidate opponents. Memes, viral videos, and orchestrated campaigns transform abstract ideology into tangible, emotional mobilization. The combination of digital amplification with in-person rallies and coordinated messaging strategies creates a feedback loop that reinforces loyalty to Trump while deepening the entrenchment of Christian nationalist ideology among followers. The consequences of this alignment are not limited to politics. Analysts and commentators warn that the intertwining of religious zealotry with political loyalty fosters an environment of hostility toward perceived outsiders, including minority groups, secular institutions, and dissenting political voices. Public discourse becomes increasingly polarized, and the mechanisms of governance, which rely on compromise and negotiation, are strained under the pressure of ideological absolutism. In extreme cases, this dynamic has contributed to heightened political violence, threats against officials, and challenges to the legitimacy of electoral processes, demonstrating the broader societal risk posed by this fusion of faith and political loyalty. Trump himself plays a central role in legitimizing and mobilizing Christian nationalist support. By framing political battles in moral and religious terms, he transforms partisan disputes into existential struggles, portraying himself as a protector of divine principles and a champion of values he claims are under threat. This strategy energizes his base, increases media attention, and consolidates loyalty, but it also deepens divisions within the broader electorate, intensifying cultural conflict and complicating efforts to build coalitions beyond his most committed supporters. Opponents of this movement argue that it represents a dangerous distortion of both religious and civic principles. By conflating spiritual obedience with political loyalty, Christian nationalist elements aligned with Trump risk eroding the distinction between church and state, marginalizing pluralistic perspectives, and promoting policies that reflect narrow ideological preferences rather than broad-based democratic consensus. Critics assert that the embrace of authoritarian tendencies under the guise of moral urgency undermines public trust in institutions, compromises checks and balances, and fosters a political environment in which dissent is delegitimized and debate is curtailed. At the same time, Trump and his allies have successfully positioned themselves as defenders against perceived cultural and ideological threats, framing opposition not simply as disagreement, but as an attack on core values. This narrative strategy intensifies the emotional and psychological stakes of political participation, transforming routine governance into a symbolic struggle over identity, morality, and the future of the nation. The result is a politically charged ecosystem in which compromise is viewed as weakness, opposition is equated with betrayal, and loyalty is measured by adherence to an intertwined set of political and religious beliefs. The implications of this movement extend into electoral politics. Christian nationalist supporters aligned with Trump are highly motivated, organized, and vocal, influencing candidate selection, voter turnout, and campaign strategies. Their priorities often extend beyond policy to encompass cultural and moral objectives, which can shift party platforms, legislative agendas, and public messaging. This influence has become a critical factor in Republican primaries, party leadership contests, and broader political calculations as candidates and officials navigate the expectations of a base that demands both ideological purity and personal loyalty. That the dangers of this alignment are systemic rather than episodic. By embedding religious ideology into partisan politics, the movement challenges the capacity for pluralism, encourages the marginalization of minority perspectives, and increases the risk of social conflict. Media coverage and scholarly analysis suggest that this fusion of faith and political allegiance, particularly when centered around a charismatic figure like Trump, has the potential to normalize extreme positions, delegitimize dissent, and create a climate in which democratic norms are eroded under the guise of moral imperative. Trump's own behavior amplifies these risks. His rhetoric often blurs the line between policy advocacy and moral crusade, framing electoral outcomes, judicial decisions, and legislative battles as struggles with divine significance. Supporters internalize this framing, interpreting political setbacks as existential threats and victories as validation of moral righteousness. This dynamic fosters heightened partisanship, intensifies social polarization, and encourages a culture of loyalty that prizes conformity over deliberation, further destabilizing the norms of civil political discourse. The societal consequences are wide-ranging. Educational debates, voting rights discussions, and public health policy are increasingly influenced by the priorities of Christian nationalist supporters, with Trump's influence amplifying their voice and impact. Communities experience heightened tension as ideological divides intersect with local governance, family dynamics, and civic participation. The emotional intensity of these conflicts, combined with the moral framing employed by both Trump and his allies, ensures that compromise becomes increasingly difficult, escalating the potential for conflict and civic unrest. Analysts warn that the long-term implications of this alignment may be profound. By fusing religious zealotry with political loyalty, Trump and his Christian nationalist supporters create a cycle in which ideology, identity, and governance reinforce one another, shaping not only electoral outcomes, but also the broader culture of political engagement. The prioritization of loyalty and moral framing over procedural fairness, deliberative debate, and institutional integrity threatens to erode trust in democratic processes, destabilize governance, and polarize society along ideological and religious lines. In response, critics call for a renewed commitment to secular governance, pluralism, and civic norms that protect both political freedom and religious diversity. They argue that resisting the excesses of Christian nationalist influence requires careful attention to policy, media literacy, and civic engagement, ensuring that public discourse remains rooted in evidence, deliberation, and respect for differing perspectives. At the same time, the continued popularity of Trump among this base illustrates the difficulty of countering a movement fueled by both identity and emotional allegiance, highlighting the enduring challenge of maintaining democratic stability in a polarized landscape. Ultimately, the intersection of Trump and Christian nationalist fervor represents one of the most potent and controversial dynamics in contemporary American politics. By aligning political ambition with ideological zeal, Trump leverages both loyalty and moral authority to consolidate support, mobilize voters, and shape public discourse. Critics argue that this strategy undermines democratic norms, marginalizes dissenting voices, and fosters a climate of exclusion and aggression, raising urgent questions about the future of pluralism, civil discourse, and institutional integrity in the United States. This evolving political landscape underscores the tension between populist mobilization and democratic accountability. While Trump's alignment with Christian nationalist supporters energizes a significant segment of the electorate, it simultaneously polarizes institutions, communities, and public debate. Young or seasoned observers of American politics are left grappling with the consequences, a movement that is highly effective in mobilizing loyalty and consolidating influence, yet deeply destabilizing for democratic norms, civil discourse, and social cohesion. The ongoing interaction of personality, ideology, and political strategy demonstrates that the stakes in this dynamic are far higher than electoral outcomes alone, extending into the very foundations of governance and public trust. The controversy surrounding Trump and his Christian nationalist base is therefore not merely a political spectacle. It is a case study in how ideology, identity, and power can intersect to challenge the principles of secular governance, pluralism, and civic integrity. By exploiting emotional allegiance, moral framing, and organizational mobilization, Trump and his allies exert influence that reshapes policy, electoral strategy, and public discourse, while critics warn of the long-term consequences for American democracy, social cohesion, and the capacity for reasoned political debate. The story is ongoing, with high stakes, profound implications, and no clear resolution in sight, highlighting the enduring tension between populist energy and institutional stability in the modern United States.